And here we go. Welcome to our free LSAT prep hour for May 28th, 2019. My name is Scott Miller. I'm going to be your instructor tonight. I'm based in Durham, North Carolina, and this is basically what I do is teach LSAT and do some other things for our company, for Manhattan Prep. I do a lot of teaching online, a lot of teaching and tutoring online. I really like online classes, and I really like these free prep hours too. I think this is a nice way to provide some information for people who maybe aren't going to take a class or are preparing on their own. We actually have quite a few good free resources on our Manhattan Prep website. So I'm going to put some links in the chat window at the end of this session for the benefit of the people who are tuning in live tonight. We also will have some people who are going to be watching this later on YouTube, and if you are one of those people watching this on YouTube, you'll probably find these same links in the description for the YouTube video. So there will be some links to some free resources, some good resources on our website that you can use to help you prepare for the LSAT. All right, and I will be answering some questions that people are putting in live here in our chat window and Q&A window tonight. You won't be able to see the chat window or the Q&A window on the YouTube video, so I'll try to read those questions out loud. Someone just asked if there are logic games videos on YouTube as well. And yeah, if you go to our Manhattan Prep YouTube channel, you will find we have quite a few free prep hour videos on there now. I think probably like 10 or 12, maybe 8 or 10. And there are several covering the logic game section of the LSAT too. In addition to logical reasoning and reading comprehension. We try to cover all the sections. We try to take turns and switch things up a little bit. So tonight we are going to be talking about logical reasoning, and specifically assumption questions in logical reasoning. And the two common types of assumption questions are really the two types of questions that are asking you directly about assumptions and arguments and what the difference is between them and how to tackle those. So we're going to start off just, we're going to dive right in, and I'm going to show you a question from an actual LSAT logical reasoning section. So here's what I want you to do. Answer the question. Do the best you can. I'm going to give you about 1 minute and 20 seconds to answer this, which may seem like a little bit of a fast pace for some people if you're new. If you've been practicing for a while, that's kind of about the average that you're shooting for, is about 1 minute and 20 seconds. So here the question is. We'll give you 1 minute and 20 seconds to work on it, and then we will talk about it. So there is that chat window. If you're here joining us live this evening, if you hover your mouse over the bottom of the screen, you'll see a button that says chat. You can open up the chat window, and I'd like you, if you're joining us here live tonight, to type your answer to the question in the chat window when you have an answer. So here's the question. All right, that was about 1 minute and 20 seconds. What I'd like everyone to do is go ahead and put an answer in the chat window, even if it's a guess. Maybe you're down to a couple of answer choices. You're trying to decide between them. If that's the case, then put in the one that you think is correct. Let's see what you guys think, even if it's a guess. Okay. So let's talk about this question. One habit that you want to get into in logical reasoning, and I'm a big fan of if you're not already doing this, is when you're working on one of these questions. So there are several parts to a logical reasoning question, right? We have the we call the stimulus, little paragraph up at the top that you read. We have the question stem, which is what you see on the screen right now, and then we have the answer choices. I'm a big fan of always reading the question stem first, because for two reasons. Basically, different LSAT questions are going to ask you to do different things. And by reading the question stem first, you'll actually get an idea of what your exact task is, what this question's asking you to do. And that's going to change the way you read the paragraph. Different, you're going to be looking for different things depending on what the question's asking you to do. So that's one good reason to read, to always read the question stem first. It's always to know what your task is before you start reading, and then because it will help you look for specific things when you're reading that little paragraph. So I'm curious, does anybody know that I mean, maybe there are different names for this type of question. What would you call this type of question? Does anybody know the name of the type of question this is? Maybe if you're familiar with Manhattan Prep terminology, what do we call this type of question? Okay. In the chat window, you can put your answer in the chat window. What do we call this? Any idea? Okay. All right. So there are a few words in here, a few words in this question stem that actually tell us what our job is and what type of question this is. So it's talking about an argument, right? The art historian's argument. That's the first really important word we see here. So what's an argument? Now, I'm not going to, we actually, let me back up a little bit. So in the last free prep hour that I led about a month ago, at the end of April, we actually talked about this topic of the different types of assumption questions and how they're different and how you approach each one. So this is a little bit of a continuation of that free prep hour that we did. I think it was April 28th. So some of the stuff that we're going to go over tonight, I'm not going to review in too much detail. I'm going to do a little bit of review, kind of maybe a fast review. So if some of this stuff goes by kind of quickly, and you want like more information, you can go back and watch again. I think it's the April 28th, 2019 free prep hour. That's the one where we covered, some of the same stuff that we're covering tonight, but in more detail. So this is kind of a continuation of that. And so one of the things we talked about in that free prep hour and some other free prep hours that we've done is the idea of an argument. It's all over the LSAT, all over logical reasoning. So the definition of an argument is the use of a supporting premise or premises to justify a conclusion. So here's an example. So I had two facts about this person, Sam. One is that Sam's car stopped running yesterday, and the other is that Sam doesn't have enough money to get it fixed. So from these two premises, these two pieces of evidence, I'm going to conclude that he won't go to the beach this weekend. So this is what an argument is. An argument is some kind of claim. In this case, it's a prediction, right? We're predicting that Sam won't go to the beach this weekend. But it's not just that claim or prediction sitting out there by itself. It's not just like an opinion. I'm giving you some evidence. I'm giving you some facts to support that opinion. That's what makes this an argument. So premises, tend to be kind of factual. They tend to be things that are either true or not. And we treat them that way on the LSAT. If you identify something as a premise, you just accept it as a fact. And then the conclusion is the claim, and maybe it's true, maybe it's not. Like, this is a prediction. He won't go to the beach this weekend. It hasn't happened yet, right? So we don't know if this is true or not. But that's what an argument is. Argument is the use of supporting premise or premises, could be more than one, to support a conclusion. So we know there's an argument here. We know when we read this little paragraph up here, we're looking for an argument. We're looking for a conclusion and supporting evidence. So can somebody give me, in the chat window, the first couple of words of the conclusion in this argument? What are the first couple of words of the conclusion? See some people saying, hence this painting. Yeah. So like the conclusion is we can consider the main point of the argument, right? We could say the whole purpose of the argument is to convince you that the conclusion is true. So what's the opinion in here? It's interesting there are actually a couple of things we might identify as a conclusion. So notice the last sentence. And what I just did here, I'm going to point this out. It's really easy when you're working, fast. The LSAT has really strict time constraints, so you're working in a logical reasoning section, you're working really fast. It's easy to try to read really fast and kind of absorb this whole thing in your mind all at once. And what can be really effective is to break, and this is like the way you should be reading. Unfortunately, we can't do it on the real LSAT like we're doing on the screen here. You can't separate these paragraphs into like separate statements. But that's what I want you to do when you're reading, like in your mind. Take a little pause at the end of each idea, at the end of each statement, at the end of each thought, at the end of each clause, if you want to be grammatical about it. You want to take a pause at the end of each one and treat these as separate thoughts or separate ideas. So the first thought, painting purportedly by Mary Cassatt is a forgery. Cassatt, is that how you say her name? I should know how to say this, how to pronounce this person's name. Cassatt, we're going to say Cassatt. The painting purportedly by Mary Cassatt is a forgery. So that kind of sounds like a claim, like really, is it a forgery? Like that sounds like an opinion. And then we have, although the canvas and other materials are consistent with most of Cassatt's work, and the subject matter is similar to that of Cassatt's finest paintings, the brush style of this painting is not found in any work known to be Cassatt's. Hence, this painting is definitely not a genuine Cassatt. So it sounds like, kind of both of these statements, it sounds like we have two statements here that could be the conclusion. One is the first one, the painting is a forgery, supposedly by Cassatt is a forgery. All right. And then we have this last statement that it's definitely not genuine. So those kind of sound like the same thing. I mean, what do you guys think? Is that last sentence just repeating what's in the first sentence? Could like either one be the conclusion? Everybody seems to be kind of gravitating towards the last one. Yeah, I mean, I think for now, sure. Let's just say that either one of those is the conclusion. The first sentence is the last sentence is kind of restating what the first sentence says. Okay. So what is the premise? What is the support? Somebody give me the first few words of the premise, the support for this. What evidence do we have to believe that this painting, I mean, you're sitting here looking at this painting, it looks like a lovely painting. It says Mary Cassatt right there at the bottom. So how do we know that it's not a genuine Cassatt? How do we know that it's a forgery? The brush style, yeah. So we have this statement here about the brush style. That's going to be our premise, our support, our evidence. Notice that we have these what about those other two statements? About the canvas and other materials and the subject matter. How do those relate to how do those other statements that we haven't boxed in there relate to the conclusion? Canvas and other materials are consistent with most of Cassatt's work. Subject matter is similar to Cassatt's finest paintings. Does anybody know what we call those? What we call those statements? Yeah, support for the opposite opposing point, right? We often call them opposing points. Excuse me. So we're not really interested in those, right? Those are, and this is a really common thing you're going to see in LSAT paragraphs and the stimulus in a logical reasoning question like this. You'll have the conclusion, the main point that this art historian is trying to make. There are also usually some counterpoints in there, or opposing points, some counter arguments. But what we're mainly interested in was what we call the argument core. We're interested in the conclusion and the support for that conclusion, which is what we have here. Okay, so, and what I'm going to say is if you want to do really well on logical reasoning, you need to be crystal clear when you're reading an argument like this, when you're working on a question like this. You need to be really crystal clear about what the conclusion is and what the support is. Don't like fudge that. Don't rush that part. What I find is very often people who are scoring pretty high on this test, right? People who are scoring, in the 160s, sometimes can do pretty well on the test just based on like their intuitive understanding of the argument. Like they're not going to break an argument down piece by piece the way we're doing right now. But you kind of get stuck, right? Maybe you're scoring at a certain score. Maybe you're scoring in the 160s and you've kind of been consistently scoring at that level and your LR score isn't improving. People say, how do I improve my score in LR? Well, if you're not doing this, if you're not able to look at an LSAT logical reasoning paragraph that they give you, if you're not able to look at one of these paragraphs and break it down like this, into a conclusion and then the premise, the supporting evidence. If you're not able to do that, then that's what you should work on. because you'd be surprised how just spending a little bit of time being crystal clear about what we call the argument core. What's the conclusion and what are the premises? Being really clear about that can help you do two things, basically. It'll help you work faster. It's going to help you understand the answer choices better. And on some of the toughest questions, some of the most difficult logical reasoning questions that you see on the LSAT, this step of understanding clearly the premise and the conclusion, not just based on like an intuitive understanding, I kind of sort of understand what the argument's about, but being crystal clear about what the conclusion is and what the support is, will help you deal with some of the more difficult questions that we see on the LSAT. So if you're not there in the 160s yet, right, if you're not, in that range, then I'm going to give you the same advice, right? Like if you're working, if maybe you're just getting started on the LSAT or you're scoring lower than that, you're trying to push your score up. Maybe you're scoring in the 140s, the 150s, trying to push your score up. This is what a big thing you should be focusing on in logical reasoning. Anytime a logical reasoning question talks about an argument, you want to be crystal clear about what the argument core is. What is the conclusion? What are the premises? What's the conclusion? What's the support? What is the actual argument? Okay, so now we know that. Now we have that. So the next important thing that we're reading, again, if we go back to the question stem, the question that we're being asked here, the historian's argument, okay, we know what the argument is, depends on assuming. So now we're talking about an assumption. So what's an assumption on the LSAT? When we talk about an assumption, what are we talking about here? What's an assumption? Can like in a few words, can you describe what an assumption is in the argument? Because they're asking us about one. Depends on assuming which one of the following. Which one of the following refers to an answer choice? So the answer choice is going to be an assumption. An assumption is the gap that needs to be filled, Sarah said. Yeah, so actually, Sarah, the assumption is related to the gap that needs to be filled. The assumption isn't actually the gap itself, but the assumption is related to the gap that needs to be filled. So an unsaid piece of information on which the argument depends. So I like that answer too. Yeah, an unsaid piece of information, an unstated piece of information. Now, on which the argument depends, in this case, yeah. But just more generally, an assumption is like an unstated piece of information. So let's talk about assumption. So three things you need to remember about assumptions on the LSAT when they're talking about an assumption. It's not explicitly stated in the argument. If I ask you for an assumption in this argument and you say, oh, the painting's a forgery, that's not an assumption, that's the conclusion. So an assumption is something that's not explicitly stated. You shouldn't be able to just read it or something similar to it right up here in the argument. An assumption doesn't simply reinforce something that's already there. So, where we say like the brush style of this painting is not found on any work known to be Cassatt's, to say something like no expert has ever identified this brush style as being used by Cassatt, right? No expert has ever identified this brush style as being used by Cassatt. Like that's kind of just restating or reinforcing our existing premise. So that's not an assumption. An assumption isn't something that like makes a premise more believable. An assumption isn't something that we would believe because of a premise or because of the conclusion. So what an assumption, that's what an assumption is not. What an assumption does is it helps the premise or premises support the conclusion. So these are the three things we want to remember about assumptions on the LSAT, three characteristics of assumptions. Make sure you know what they're not, and then keep in mind what they actually do, the function that they perform. So this is what we're looking for the answer choice to do, to help the premise or premises support the conclusion. Okay, so there's one more important word in here in our question stem. We've been picking this question stem apart, right? We know what the argument is. The argument is the conclusion. The painting is definitely not a genuine Cassatt. Painting purportedly by Mary Cassatt is a forgery. That's our conclusion. The premise is that the brush style is not found in any work known to be Cassatt's. So we know what assumption is. We're looking for something that helps this premise support this conclusion. And you can kind of see, maybe we should back up a little bit here. You kind of see that maybe this isn't a convincing argument, right? So if they're asking you for an assumption in an argument, you know right away that there's a problem with the argument. And most arguments you see on the LSAT have a problem. They're not convincing arguments, right? If they're asking you for an assumption, if they're asking you to strengthen an argument, if they're asking you to weaken an argument, if they're asking you to, I don't know, about a flaw in an argument, there's a problem with an argument. So there's a problem with the argument if they're asking you to do any of those things. So this is asking you for an assumption that the argument depends on. What do you mean by depends? Well, depends means that we're looking for a necessary assumption. So 1,000 points to the people who said necessary assumption when I asked what type of question this is. You're correct. That's what we call this, a necessary assumption question. Well, what does that mean? Well, when you think about necessary assumptions on the LSAT, what I want you to think of is objections. I want you to think about objections. So when a question asks you for an assumption on which the argument depends, we're thinking about possible objections to the argument. So if we go back to our little sample argument here, Sam's car stopped running yesterday. He doesn't have enough money to get it fixed, therefore he won't go to the beach this weekend. If we think of some possible objections to this argument, like, well, maybe someone will lend him enough money to get his car fixed, right? Or maybe someone will give him a ride to the beach. So if either of these things are true, we don't know that either of these things are true, but if either of these things are true, then these premises don't necessarily support our conclusion. Our argument doesn't hold up anymore, right? So if either of these things are true, it creates a problem for our argument. Either of these things would harm the argument. That's what an objection does to an argument. So it is necessary for us to assume, in order for this argument to have any hope of holding up, in order for this conclusion to have any chance of being proven by these premises, in order for this argument to have any chance of being convincing, we have to assume each of these two things. We have to assume that no one will lend Sam enough money to get his car fixed. We also have to assume that no one will give Sam a ride to the beach. So either of these things by itself is what we call a necessary assumption. So the way, and again, there are a lot of different ways of thinking about necessary assumptions. You may have heard of necessary assumptions described in a number of different ways. What I want you thinking about when you're working on a necessary assumption question, when you look at the answer choices, is it something that defends the argument against a possible objection? That's what you need to think of. Is the answer choice something that would defend the argument against a possible objection? That's what will tell you if it's a necessary assumption. That's what a necessary assumption does. Okay? What you're not looking for is something that makes the argument totally whole, totally convincing. You're not looking for something that guarantees the conclusion. That's a different type of question. We're going to look at that in a minute. So it's okay. Like if you look at either of these by itself, neither of these by itself, like just the fact that no one will lend Sam enough money to get his car fixed, that by itself doesn't guarantee that he won't go to the beach this weekend. No one will give Sam a ride to the beach. That by itself doesn't guarantee that he won't go to the beach this weekend. Maybe he can walk to the beach. Maybe he can ride his bike to the beach, right? So there are almost a limitless number of objections that for any argument, you can come up with almost a limitless number of objections if you get creative. So no one single necessary assumption is going to make the argument completely guaranteed. And I think this is where people really go wrong when they think about necessary assumptions, is you look at the answer choice and you go, well, that doesn't really guarantee anything, right? No one will give Sam a ride to the beach. No one will lend Sam enough money to get his car fixed. Well, that doesn't really guarantee the argument, doesn't complete the argument, doesn't fill the gap in the argument. So that's why we're not even worried about that. We're just thinking about objections and does the answer choice defend the argument against the possible objections. So Kaylee, I saw your question in the chat window. What are some methods that allow us to identify a necessary assumption question? That's an excellent question. And this is what helps us do that. It's when you see a question stem that talks about something the argument depends on assuming. And there's some other language we're going to look at in a minute, but that's what tells us we're dealing with a necessary assumption question. An assumption that the argument depends on. That tells you it's a necessary assumption question. All right, so let's look for a moment at this objection. Maybe someone will lend Sam enough money to get his car fixed, and this necessary assumption, no one will lend Sam enough money to get his car fixed. If you look at the relationship between the two, those two statements negate one another. And what I mean by that is they can't both be true at the same time, right? So if you say, maybe someone will lend Sam enough money to get his car fixed, right? If that's your objection, if I say, no one will lend Sam enough money to get his car fixed, that's a fact. Well, I've just negated your objection. If I say no one will lend Sam enough money to get his car fixed, and you say, well, maybe someone will lend Sam enough money to get his car fixed, you're negating. By saying maybe someone will lend Sam enough money to get his car fixed, you're negating the statement over here. So this is what a necessary assumption does. It negates a possible objection. You could also say that the objection is the negation of the necessary assumption. Right. So this is what one of the basically, again, negation gets to be kind of a complex topic. There's a lot of different ways to talk about it, but a simple way to think of this is a statement and its negation cannot both be true at the same time. So these two statements are the negation of one another. They can't both be true at the same time. All right. And so when we're talking about necessary assumptions, all right, we see this language saying the art historian's argument depends on assuming which of the following. We know it's a necessary assumption question. Well, now we know what we're doing when we look at the answer choices. We're looking for a answer choice that defends the argument against a possible objection. So, let's see. Sarah Armstrong, I'm going to ask you, would you mind, you don't have to if you don't want to, let me know in the chat window, would you mind hopping up, if I ask you to hop on the mic, would you be willing to do that and talk to me about one or two of these answer choices? Let me know in the chat window if you're willing to hop on the mic. Okay, so go ahead and click on in the lower left corner of the window, you should see something that says unmute. Unmute.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly. Okay. Will you talk to me about one of these answer choices that you know is wrong? And can you tell me why it's wrong? Any ideas?
Okay. I think A is wrong.
Can you tell me why A is wrong?
Because it doesn't mention the brush style at all.
Okay. Does it have to mention the brush style? Does the answer choice have to mention the brush style?
I guess not.
Yeah, so
it feels very out of scope.
It's an interesting question, right? So this is, and I'm totally actually very, very glad that you said that, because this is a really important point about necessary assumption questions that you need to remember. So if we go back to this this sample here, Sarah, help me with this. Would you agree that this is a necessary assumption for this argument, that we have to assume that no one will lend Sam enough money to get his car fixed in order for the argument to hold up?
Yes.
Okay. Did the original argument that I gave you, ever say anything about anyone lending Sam money?
No.
Yeah. So, like, a necessary assumption, the correct answer can bring in totally new information. Right? It can bring in, because, objections can kind of come out of left field. Objections kind of by their nature are bringing in information that the argument didn't take into consideration. And so two things to remember about necessary assumptions. They don't have to directly mention something that was mentioned usually they do. Usually they will mention something that was mentioned in the argument, but they can totally bring in new information. And so when we look at answer choice A, it's not just, you have to be really careful looking at an answer like A and saying, oh, it doesn't talk about brush style, because it could bring up something that a necessary assumption could bring in some new piece of information that actually wasn't mentioned in the original argument.
Yeah, I guess now that I'm looking at it, it actually is, it is a necessary assumption.
Okay. So, okay, so why is it necessary? Why do we have to assume that the type of canvas and other materials that Cassatt used in most of her work were readily available to others?
Because for somebody to be able to forge her work, they would need the canvas and other materials that she used, because the canvas and other materials were used in the forgery.
Okay. So here's a really useful thing to do. I'm gonna have you do one more thing with me, if you would.
Okay.
So maybe you pick answer choice A, right? You really like answer choice A. Yeah, A is a great answer, and you pick it, and then you find out it's wrong. So I'm going to tell you right now, answer choice A is actually wrong.
Yeah,
yeah. Kind of messing with you here. All right. So can you tell me now? Let's say you like it. Oh yeah, it is necessary, and then you realize it's wrong. You find out it's wrong. So can you figure out now, knowing that it's wrong? Can you figure out why it's wrong?
It's sufficient. Right? Is that right? I feel like that's right.
Okay, so just because the canvas and other material, it's not sufficient. I'm not gonna go too far down that road. It's not sufficient. So let me, you're saying that somebody had to be able to have the canvas and other type of materials in order to forge her work, right?
Yes.
Okay. Does that mean it needed to be readily available? What does readily available mean? Like, what's something you could think of that's like readily available somewhere near where you live? Like maybe
Toothpaste?
toothpaste. Sure, toothpaste is readily available. It's all over the place. So, do you have to if a person was going to forge Cassatt's work, did they have to be able to like go to any store and be able to buy the canvas and other materials just like you can buy toothpaste, or do they just have to be able to get it somewhere?
Somewhere.
Yeah, so readily available is actually what makes answer choice A wrong.
Okay.
That's why it's not necessary. Like we do have to now this is kind of interesting. It's kind of interesting that you picked this answer choice because we do have to assume if we took readily out of there, like if we got rid of the readily, then we would have to assume in order for the painting to be a forgery, we would have to assume that the canvas and other materials were available to others in order for them to be able to forge her work and have the canvas and materials consistent. So this could be sort of like what you would expect in a necessary assumption question, but because of readily, it's a wrong answer. So and I want to give you a piece of advice that can be really, really helpful. Like if you were looking at answer choice A and maybe one other answer that both looked appealing, a really good trick to do, and this is a common situation that people are in. And Sarah, you can hop off the mic if you want. Thank you very much for your help with that. Really common situation that people get into is they're down to two answer choices and both answers look good, right? So one thing you can do in that situation is slow down and read both answers a little more slowly, and you might find one word in there that all of a sudden stands out at you as suspicious. Okay, let's see. Let's move on. Let's move on to a different. How about Justice? Justice, do you want to hop on the mic and help me with this? Would you be able to let me know in the chat window? Are you okay with hopping on the mic? I know sometimes people are places where they can't necessarily talk. Justice, do you want to hop on the mic? If not, you can just let me know in the chat window that you don't want to be on the mic, and that's fine.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly. Yes, thank you. Okay. Now, you picked answer choice B. Can you tell me why answer choice B is correct?
Is it correct?
Why do you think it's correct?
Well, I think it's correct because it discusses that the way that her brush style was not, yeah. You know what I'm trying to say. It's just the brush style here of the painting is not found in any work known to be Cassatt's.
Mm-hmm.
And I think B is right because it basically refutes what's going on here.
So B refutes what's going on, refutes the argument. So is B like an objection that would hurt the argument? Is that what you're saying?
I know what I'm trying to say, but I can't get the words.
That's a really common problem when we talk. It's one of the things that makes talking about the LSAT really difficult is people say, I know what I'm thinking, right? It makes sense. I just can't like explain it. So that's okay. Thank you for your help. Thank you for giving it a shot. Let's see. So let's look at answer choice B. So remember a moment ago, and you can hop off the mic if you want, Justice. Thank you very much. Remember a moment ago, I was talking about negation, right? That a statement and its negation can't both be true at the same time. So that's one way to test if an answer choice is necessary, is we negate that answer choice. And so, what you do, you look at the answer choice and see if you can turn that into a statement that can't be true at the same time as the answer choice. So if I want to negate an answer choice B, if I want to negate answer choice B, I want to turn it into a statement that can't be true at the same time as answer choice B. So if none of Cassatt's works is painted using a brush style, blah, blah, blah. Well, what if I say some of Cassatt's works are painted using a brush style that is not exhibited in any of her known works? What does that do to the argument? What do you guys think? In the chat window, let me know. What if B, if this negated form of B, what I've done is I've taken answer choice B and I've negated it. If this negated statement is true, Sarah, you're saying it ruins the argument. Do you want to hop back on the mic and tell me, how does that ruin the argument? Can you explain that to me? I know this stuff is hard to explain, right? But can you explain, how does that ruin the argument?
If some of Cassatt's works are painted using a brush style that is not exhibited in any of her known works, then the premise that the argument is based on, that the brush style of this painting is not found in any work known to be Cassatt's, doesn't matter.
Yeah, that's an excellent explanation, right? It doesn't, that premise no longer supports the conclusion, no longer convinces us that the conclusion is true, all right? So that's what we're looking to do, right? So this is why negation is so important to understand. If you take an answer choice and you negate it, and that negated form of the answer choice, maybe we should start calling this the mutated form, right? I don't know if you're like into science fiction. Mutation. So we've mutated this answer choice. We've turned it into a negated answer choice. If that mutated answer choice destroys the argument, then that answer choice B actually is a necessary assumption. Because in order for the argument to have any chance of being correct, we have to assume that this negated form, this objection, is not true. So if that's an objection that hurts the argument, it is necessary to assume that none of Cassatt's works is painted using a brush style. It's not exhibited in any other known works. Right? And you know, again, if this was true, if some of her works are painted using a brush style that's not exhibited in any of her other works, like the painting could still be a forgery. The painting could still be, oh, somebody in the chat window asked me to explain it one more time. Okay. So our main piece of evidence, the evidence that's supposed to convince us that the painting is a forgery, is that this has some weird brush style, right? This painting has a brush style that we haven't found in any work known to be Cassatt's. So it's the brush style. The brush style is different from all of Cassatt's known works. But what if it's true that some of Cassatt's works are painted using a brush style that's not exhibited in any of her known works? Now, one thing to realize about what we're saying here is this is an assumption. We don't have to know that it's true. It's just like, if this was true, this is all about if. If this statement was true, if some of the works are painted using a brush style that's not exhibited in any of her known works, if that was true, what effect would that have on the argument? Well, then we wouldn't care if the brush style of this particular painting is in the same category, right? Because it could still be one of Cassatt's works. It's just a brush style that's not known. So this is an objection that would harm the argument, that would make more evidence about the brush style of this painting not match, not support. This evidence no longer supports this conclusion, no longer convinces us that this conclusion is true. So do you get that, Justice? Do you get how this would actually harm our argument? This negated form of B would harm the argument? Okay, so if the negated form would harm the argument, then we have to assume, it is necessary to assume that this isn't true, that none of the works are painted using a brush style that is not exhibited in any other known works. So the negation test is a really powerful tool. Now, I don't want to have to negate every answer choice, right? So I'm looking for ways to kind of like we eliminated answer choice A. When I first look at the answer choices, I'm looking for things that would definitely that stand out as wrong to me. The most characteristic feature of the work is the brush style. The most characteristic feature there was. So we don't like the fact, what if the most characteristic feature of the work is not the brush style? Well, it's the brush style is a piece of evidence. It doesn't have to be the most characteristic feature. So if we can recognize that something's wrong with an answer choice, like it doesn't have to be the most characteristic feature. It just has to be a feature. So most characteristic is a problem for D. If we can eliminate like maybe 2 or 3 answer choices, just because without negating them, if we can eliminate answer choices without negating them, then if you're down to 2 answer choices and you're trying to figure out which one is correct, if you have to choose between 2 remaining answer choice, then that's where the negation test becomes useful. If you negate an answer and it turns into something that would destroy the argument or harm the argument, then it is a necessary assumption. If you negate an answer choice and it really doesn't have any effect on the argument, then it's not necessary. So try to use the negation test sparingly. And especially on some complicated answer choices, it can be, just trying to figure out what the negation is can be a little difficult. So we try to look for other reasons like readily or most characteristic feature that allow us to eliminate answer choices. And then if we have to, we use the negation test to make a final decision. But this is what necessary assumption questions are all about. It's about finding the answer choice that defends the argument against an objection that would prevent the argument from being true. We don't care. Like answer choice B doesn't make the argument whole. It doesn't guarantee that the conclusion is true, but it is one thing that's necessary. It is one thing that we have to assume. All right. So that's necessary assumptions. Let's answer a question that somebody asked earlier, which is how do we know when we're dealing with a necessary assumption question? So these are some common question stems that you're going to see that all indicate a necessary assumption question. The art historian's argument depends on assuming which one of the following. Which one of the following is an assumption required by the argument? The argument requires assuming which of the following. So any language in a question stem that indicates that we're looking for an assumption in an argument and it's an assumption the argument depends on, or that's required or that's necessary, that kind of language tells us that we're dealing with a necessary assumption question. Okay. So one of the questions that people have, one of the questions that people asked in well, before we go to that, before we switch gears here a little bit, take a moment and think about your takeaways. Write some notes to yourself. And this is a really good way. This is a way that we recommend that you structure your notes for the LSAT. This can be a really good way to structure your notes. The next time I see blank, I will blank. So next time I see next time I see language that talks about an assumption on which the argument depends or is required in a question stem, I know it's a necessary assumption question. Next time I see a question that asks about an assumption, I will be sure to clearly identify the premise and conclusion. The next time I see the next time I'm trying to decide between 2 answer choices in a necessary assumption question, I will negate one of the answer choices. Next time I see a necessary assumption question, I will remember that I'm looking for something that defends against an objection, right? Anything that's going to help you, any kind of specific thing that is going to help you remember what to do when you're facing one of these questions. All right, so let's look at a different question. I'm going to show you another question. I'm going to do the same thing we did earlier. I'm going to give you 1 minute and 20 seconds to answer this question. 1 minute and 20 seconds to answer this question. Same thing as before. Put your answer in the chat window when you have it. And then we'll talk about it. All right, here it is. All right, that was a minute and 20 seconds. We don't have a lot of questions coming in here. So let's see. If anybody has a guess, if anybody's like down to 2 answer choices, maybe you feel good about taking a guess, go ahead and put it in the chat window. What's your guess? Not even a lot of guesses coming in. Oh, a few. Okay. All right. So this is a new type of question. This is a different type of question. We're still talking about an argument, right? A conclusion of the ethicist's argument. And we're talking about an assumption, which is the following: if assumed, enables the conclusion to be properly drawn. Does anybody know what type of question this is? Is this the same type of question we were just looking at? Is this a necessary assumption question? I see sufficient assumption, SA, sufficient assumption. Okay. Justify the conclusion. Okay, that might be a way of describing it. So what we're trying to do here, our task here, this is what we call a sufficient assumption question. What our task is for this question is to basically make the argument whole. They're giving us, again, a damaged argument, an argument with a problem, an argument with a gap in it, an argument that might not actually hold up, that might not be true. And our job is to make that argument, make the premise guarantee the conclusion. So here's an argument, a sample argument. Jenna is Ian's friend. Therefore, Jenna lives in Florida. All right. So what's the assumption in this argument? Can anybody tell me in the chat window, what's the assumption? Let me rephrase that. What's a premise that we could add to this argument that would guarantee the conclusion? All right. Yeah, I see it. Okay, I see it in the chat window. All of Ian's friends live in Florida. Okay. Ian only has friends that live in Florida. Exactly. So if we add that to the argument, all of Ian's friends live in Florida. So this is like the missing premise, right? If we add this to the argument, then we have what we call a valid argument. If Jenna is Ian's friend and all of Ian's friends live in Florida, then now this conclusion is guaranteed. Jenna lives in Florida. So that's what we're looking for in a sufficient assumption question. In this case, we're not really worried about objections. We're looking for the missing piece that will make the argument whole, that will make the premise they give us or premises they give us guarantee the conclusion. So a very common feature of the arguments in sufficient assumption questions is there's a new idea in the conclusion. So remember, the premise is supposed to support the conclusion, right? The premise is supposed to be the evidence that convinces you the conclusion's true. But notice that the premise and conclusion are talking about 2 different things. They're both telling us about Jenna, right? So there's a common concept, a common person, place, or thing in the premise and conclusion, which is Jenna. But the premise is telling us one thing about Jenna. Jenna's Ian's friend. The conclusion is telling us something totally new, something totally different. Jenna lives in Florida. Well, how is this premise supposed to support about Jenna being Ian's friend, supposed to support a conclusion about somebody living in Florida? So that kind of shift is really important to notice. If you can find that kind of shift, if you can find the premise and conclusion in the argument, the sufficient assumption question, and then find the new idea in the conclusion, the new thing in the conclusion, and find the thing in the premise that doesn't match up with the conclusion, you can identify the sufficient assumption, because that's what the sufficient assumption has to do. Sufficient assumption, in order for this argument to be valid, in order for this conclusion to follow from the premise, that we're given, we have to link Ian's friends with living in Florida. We have to know that all Ian's friends live in Florida. So in this case, like in that last argument we were looking at, like we were talking about how, you know, an argument can, a necessary assumption, the answer choice can bring in new information, right? Like just because an answer choice in a necessary assumption question, just because an answer choice brings in new information doesn't necessarily make it, it's not necessarily a bad thing. But in a sufficient assumption question, we're not looking for new information. In a sufficient assumption question, we're looking for an answer choice that addresses items already given to us in the premise and conclusion. This is where we're looking for answer choices that, you know, we would say the answer choice in this case has to involve things that we already know about. Has to involve Ian's friend and has to involve living in Florida. That's what we're looking for in a sufficient assumption question. So let's let's see how that's going to work with this question that we were just looking at. So what's the conclusion in this argument? Somebody give me the first couple words of the conclusion in this argument. Does anybody know what the conclusion is? In the chat window, give me the first 2 or 3 words of the conclusion. Okay, I'm seeing a few different answers. So therefore is the thing that we want to pay attention to. We want to pay attention to indicator words, certain words on the LSAT that indicate that you are about to read a conclusion. Therefore is one of them. When you see therefore, thus, hence, so, words like that indicate that you're about to see a conclusion. There are some really common conclusion indicators that you're going to see in LSAT logical reasoning, and you want to be able to recognize them. You want to know those when you see them. So the word therefore should stand out to you, just as if there's a big box around it like this. That tells you that you're about to read the conclusion. And it tells us that what came before is our support, is our premise. So again, I'm gonna split this apart the way we would want to read this. We would want to, when we're reading this argument, we want to notice this therefore. And the conclusion, we must reject Tolstoy's rash claim. I'm not even going to read the rest of it, right? That's our conclusion. And this first part is our premise. So this is kind of abstract, right? I mean, maybe part of the problem that people had with this argument is that it's kind of, I don't know, abstract philosophical argument, right? Wonky. Yeah, thank you, Sarah. That's exactly the word I was looking for. Sarah said wonky in the chat window. All right, so here's what I want you to do, though. Remember, Jenna is Ian's friend, therefore Jenna lives in Florida. Can anybody find what's the thing that appears? What's the Jenna in this argument? What's the thing that appears in both the premise and the conclusion? Can somebody tell me that in the chat window? What do I have in this argument that appears in both premise and conclusion? Yeah, the actions. When we know a lot about events that lead to an action. Okay, so both the premise and the conclusion are about knowing a lot about events leading up to any action. That's the Jenna in this argument. What is the living in Florida? What is the new idea in the conclusion that doesn't appear anywhere in the premise? Yeah, Ali said freely performed. Exactly. Action freely performed. New idea, right? Action freely performed. All right. So what's the Ian's friend? What's the thing in the premise that doesn't appear in the conclusion? Yeah, justified in praising and blaming. Okay, so with a sufficient assumption question, if you identify a question as a sufficient assumption question, and you can get this far, right? If you can identify the conclusion, if you can, and this is, again, this is where, people were asking, what's the difference between sufficient assumption and necessary assumption? So we already talked about necessary assumption. We talked about necessary assumptions deal with objections. And sufficient assumptions, this is how they're different. This is what your task is, or this is the way you can attack a sufficient assumption question. For a sufficient assumption question, we find the conclusion, we find the premise, and then we look for the thing in, you see if there's something in the conclusion that doesn't appear in the premises. And vice versa, see if there's something that appears in the premises that doesn't appear in the conclusion. If you can find those things, then you should be able to at least narrow down the answer choices. So just like in my previous little silly example, right? We're looking for the thing that connects Ian's friend with living in Florida, right? So for this question, we are looking for the answer choice that connects justified in praising or blaming with action freely performed. Okay, so all I want you to do now when I show you the answer choices is look for the answer choices, and if an answer choice doesn't link those two, let's just assume for now that it's not correct, and see how many answer choices do we have that somehow link justified in praising and blaming to the action being freely performed. Which answer choice, if any, does that for us, links those two things together? Which answer choice or answer choices? Put the letter of the answer choice or answer choice in the chat window. Answer choice or answer choices, if there's more than one, that link those two things together. Okay, I'm seeing some answers in the chat window. So notice that some of these we can get rid of pretty quickly, right? Like A doesn't say anything about an action being freely performed. B doesn't say anything about an action being freely performed. D doesn't say anything about an action being freely performed. Oh, E does. E talks about an action being freely performed. So only C and E, those are the only answer choices that talk about actions being freely performed. And out of the two, C is the only one that links an action being freely performed with being justified for praising or blaming a person. So this is our task in a sufficient assumption question. This is what we're trying to do. We need to identify, we still need to identify. If they're asking us about an assumption for an argument, we need to first identify, we need to understand the argument, identify the conclusion, identify the premise, the support, the evidence. And then we want to, if it's a sufficient assumption question, these can be very formulaic, right? Sometimes we call these idea math. So you need to find and see if there's a new idea in the conclusion. You need to spot and see, is there not something in the conclusion that was never mentioned in the premise? And vice versa, if there's something in the premise that was never mentioned in the conclusion. So if there's a new idea in the conclusion, it has to appear. If there's a new idea in the conclusion, and it's a sufficient assumption question. This is only for sufficient assumption questions. If there's a new idea in the conclusion, it has to appear in the correct answer. Get rid of any answer choices that don't include that new idea. And then if there's more than one answer remaining, then you look for the one that links the new idea in the conclusion with that idea in the premise that doesn't appear in the conclusion. And then you should be there. Now, there are somebody in the chat window, does the order matter? If it was reversed, would that matter? And the answer is yes. So this is where they can get a little bit more complicated. And this is where you need to understand conditional logic, which we don't have time to get too deep into conditional logic tonight. Maybe we'll do that. I think, we may have done, I got to look and see what topics we've covered. I think we've covered conditional logic. I think Dimitri Farber did a free prep hour on conditional logic last year. So you can look that up on our YouTube channel. And maybe we'll do another one again, but if you see two answer choices that both deal with these topics, right? If we had two answer choices that deal with justified in praising or blaming and an action that's freely performed, then we need to think about the direction of the logic. And that's where conditional logic comes in. That's where we need to understand if-then statements, only if, only when, and unless. And we need to use that understanding to make the final decision between two answer choices. But with what I just showed you here, you can use this as the basis to answer some sufficient assumption questions pretty quickly. And even on the more challenging ones, you can at least narrow down the answer choices. You can at least get rid of the answer choices, eliminate the answer choices that are just have no way of being correct. And maybe you get down to a 50-50 guess, which is better than 1 out of 5, right? So here's what I'm going to suggest you do. First of all, let's do a little quick review to wrap up some of the stuff we talked about tonight. We talked about necessary assumptions. We talked about sufficient assumptions. So here's the wording that you're going to see in the question stem of the necessary assumption question. Here's the wording that you're going to see in the question stem of sufficient assumption question. In the question stem of a sufficient assumption question. The sufficient assumption questions talk about enabling the conclusion to be properly drawn. the conclusion follows logically if which of the following is assumed. So we're looking for an answer choice that we can plug right into the argument and patch that hole between the premise and the conclusion. We're looking for an answer choice that's basically like a missing premise, right? What I want you to notice mainly about the sufficient assumption question stems is that they're not talking about something being required or something the argument depends on or something necessary. These two at the bottom, the sufficient assumption question stems, are missing that language about depends, required, necessary. So if you see that language, an assumption the argument depends on or required or necessary, that's where we're dealing with a necessary assumption question. That's where we need to shift our thinking to objections. What's an objection that would harm the argument? We're looking for an answer choice that addresses an objection that would harm the argument. It doesn't have to make the argument whole. It doesn't have to, even necessarily, it could deal with something that seems a little bit out of scope, right? Just because an answer choice seems out of scope doesn't totally match what's already talked about in the argument. It's not necessarily a wrong answer in a necessary assumption question. That's one thing that trips people up. Remember, in a necessary assumption question, we can negate the answer choice to see whether or not it's necessary. If you negate an answer choice in a necessary assumption question and you end up with something that would harm the argument, then boom, it is a necessary assumption. Sufficient assumption questions, again, we're looking to link the premise and the conclusion. The negation test doesn't work for sufficient assumption questions. An answer to a sufficient assumption question can do more than it needs to. Doesn't have to be true, but it is going to totally patch. It's a big band-aid that we can slap on the argument and connect the premise to the conclusion and link those two together. Sufficient assumption questions, look for a new idea in the conclusion. If there is one, use that as a tool in the answer choices. If there isn't a new idea in the conclusion, then look for your premises and see if there are two premises that need to be linked together. That's something else you'll see in the sufficient assumption question. But these are some basic strategies, and hopefully what this gives you is an idea of how these two question types are different. What you're looking for in one and not necessarily looking for in the other. Necessary assumption questions, we don't have to, make the argument totally convincing. Think about objections when you think about necessary assumption questions. Does the answer defend the argument against an objection? Sufficient assumption questions, we're not necessarily worried about objections. We need to plug that missing piece in there and make the argument whole. Negation test does not help us with sufficient assumption questions. New idea in the conclusion in a sufficient assumption question has to be there. If there is a new idea in the conclusion, has to be there in the answer choice. Has to. Not so with a necessary assumption question. So hopefully this gives you an idea of how they're different. And again, if you are watching this on YouTube, look at our April 2019 free prep hours, and there's going to be another one in there, or another video on the same topic, necessary assumptions, sufficient assumption questions. And we do a little bit more of the preliminary work there, a little bit more background. We look at a couple different questions, look at it at a little bit different angle. So if you want some more information about the difference between these two question types and how to approach them, check out that video too. Check out our other videos on our YouTube channel. There are videos about reading comprehension questions. There are questions about logic games. We try to cover all the sections of the LSAT. And like I said, if you're watching us on YouTube, check out the description for the video here. You'll see some links to other free resources that we have on our website. And few different free resources that you might find useful. We have our LSAT blog. There's some good information in the LSAT blog about different topics. We have our forums where you can find explanations for different LSAT questions. You can try session 1 of any of our live online or in-person courses for free. You do have to sign up, but you can attend for free. And we also have our LSAT Interact on-demand courses that you can check out a couple of those lessons for free. So I recommend you check out our free options. And again, for those of you who are here live, I'll go ahead and put the links in the chat window that you can check out. So thanks to everyone who is here tonight. And if you didn't get a chance to be here with us live tonight, then we do these every month. We do these free prep hours actually twice a month. usually 2 times a month. One of our instructors comes on and does these live. So check out our website for a list of upcoming free prep hours. And so yeah, for those of you who are here tonight live, thank you very much. For those of you who watched on YouTube, thank you very much. Have a good night and happy LSATing.